Almost everything that comes out of Trump's mouth is a lie. I don't think he's just doing it to show that he can do it, although he certainly loves being an authoritarian. I think there are reasons that have to do with imperialism. It's all connected. U.S. imperialism, the law of the jungle, violating international law with impunity, lack of accountability, and these so-called sanctions, unilateral coercive measures, highly illegal, but aimed to strangle countries and make them knuckle under to the will of the U.S. government, in this case, Donald Trump.
Welcome to episode 281 of the Refuse Fascism podcast, a podcast brought to you by volunteers with Refuse Fascism. I'm Sam Goldman, one of those volunteers and host of the show. Refuse Fascism works to unite all who can be united in mass, relentless, non-violent resistance to drive the Trump fascist regime from power. This week, we are sharing an interview with legal scholar and political analyst Marjorie Cohn to discuss the collapse of limits on U.S. power internationally. Before we get started, however, I want to give a quick thank you to everyone who rates and reviews the podcast, supports us on Patreon, subscribes on Substack, and picks up merch. That support is how this platform keeps going and growing. And if you're listening and haven't done that yet, after this episode, take a moment to rate the show, subscribe, or become a patron. It helps us get these ideas out where they actually need to be. Trump MAGA fascism is accelerating and working overtime to lock down their grip on society and consolidate their program. And we have to start with the basic reminder that anybody telling you that the elections will resolve this, that you need to pour all your energies into midterms, are dragging you into the abyss. Because really, rely on the very elections that the fascists are moving to rig and steal? This week, the House passed the SAVE Act, a bill that, if signed into law, would vastly restrict Americans' access to voting. The SAVE Act would take unprecedented federal control over elections, even as the Constitution mandates that they be managed by the states. It would require proof of citizenship, like passports and birth certificates, for people to register to vote. But as the Center for American Progress notes, about half of Americans don't have a valid passport, and 69 million women in the U.S. wouldn't be able to use a birth certificate to prove their citizenship because they changed their last name when they got married. The bill would also require states to regularly purge their voter rolls and make voter information available to the Department of Homeland Security. It's unlikely, though not impossible, that the bill will pass the Senate. Yet even if it stalls there, Trump has promised to essentially push it through via executive order. Before you say, he can't do that, think about how many things he supposedly can't do that he's already done. Not only is this bill incredibly discriminatory against women and trans people for similar reasons, not only does it effectively present a poll tax, but it is based in undisguised white supremacy and American chauvinism. There is no proof of any significant voter fraud in the United States. Trump and the Republicans know that their agenda cannot win in an open contest, and their strategy rests on stopping demographics who overwhelmingly vote against them from casting their ballots. Kristi Noem said as much this past Friday.
When it gets to election day, that we've been proactive to make sure that we have the right people voting, electing the right leaders to lead this country through the days that we have.
Now, more than ever, we cannot rely on elections to stop this regime, which is accelerating every day towards consolidating fascist rule. Our actions must break out of politics as normal to nonviolently drive this regime from power. Trump's EPA has repealed its own scientific determination that provides the legal basis for the U.S. government to take any action regarding climate change. Let's be clear on the stakes here. The climate change being fueled by capitalism, imperialism is unprecedented in the history of this planet. Not only is it already warming the planet faster than any previous climate change. Not only is that already having very real effects on the environment and people's lives, but it is on the brink of causing powerful positive feedback loops through changing global ocean currents, melting ice caps, and a number of other mechanisms that combined can spell the end of human civilization and possibly the extinction of humanity itself. This decision categorically strips U.S. government agencies from regulating contributions to global warming in any meaningful way. It seems the most immediate effects will come into play in the auto industry, but this likely has far-reaching impact throughout both industry and science itself. In addition to understanding the impact of this decision, we have to understand the reason for this decision. It's not just that fascism is fueling climate catastrophe, but this climate change itself is fueling fascism. Anthropogenic climate change is not produced by humans in the abstract. It is produced by the specific production relations of the system we live under, capitalism, imperialism, and its corresponding power structures. These are what drive the continued extraction of and reliance on fossil fuels, regardless of their harms to our shared planet. Retaining global reliance on fossil fuels and exerting control and influence over the sources of fossil fuels are both central to exercising power in this global setup. As this climate change and its sources have become more and more undeniable, the rulers of the United States have had two different basic approaches to dealing with this. One approach, primarily associated with the Democratic Party, is to acknowledge climate change, to do a lot of hand-wringing about it, and to mitigate this problem in relatively minor ways as part of an overall approach that maintains their influence and control over fossil fuel production and maintains the political power that comes along with that. How long this approach can sustain itself is unclear, but the fascist approach is to functionally embrace climate change. They recognize that under the system of capitalist imperialism, any mitigations of this existential crisis hampers their competitiveness on the global stage. This approach provides a surprisingly big umbrella covering straight up anti-science, alternate reality coming from Trump himself, end times fundamentalist belief that either ignores climate change or sees it as part of the Great Reckoning, as well as those who see some of the short-term effects of climate change as a boon to their industrial and military exploits, whether that be sea routes through an ice-free Arctic, wider opportunities for fossil fuel extraction, or even the prospect of more brutal dominance over more desperate peoples. This approach is what's served by this week's announcement from the EPA. This is what's served by Trump commanding the military to use more coal. This is what's served by quitting international climate agreements. This is what's served by the regime cutting funding from NASA and NOAA and stigmatizing science itself as woke lunacy. This announcement has already provoked legal challenges. The scientific determination that is being overturned was itself enabled by a 2007 Supreme Court ruling in Massachusetts for CPA that ruled the Clean Air Act could be used to regulate greenhouse emissions. But with today's fascist-packed Supreme Court, there's every reason to believe that SCOTUS will back this move, potentially even expanding the scope of harm. For any hope for humanity's future, this regime must be removed at the soonest possible time. And that's up to us, again, by taking to the streets in our millions, by not backing down, but growing in size, and in our determination that Trump must go now. Now, while today's interview focuses on what the Trump regime is doing internationally, we have to talk about Minnesota, which was the topic of last week's episode. The main news out of Minnesota this week is the supposed scaling down of ICE operations, but just about every detail of what that means is contested. 700 agents were allegedly reassigned, but that still leaves 2,000 agents. For reference, Minneapolis only has about 600 police officers in total. Tom Homan has claimed unprecedented cooperation with local leaders, but Hennepin County Jail, the state's largest, and numerous area sheriffs have publicly stated that they have not changed their policy. Gabby Zavale of The Verge has analyzed that the same day DHS announced the end of the surge, ICE activity increased in small towns outside of Minneapolis. And whether they are in the Dilley concentration camp in Texas or anywhere else across ICE's detention archipelago, those Minnesotans who have been swept up are still living in deprivation and fear, whether Operation Metro Surge is over or not. What we do know is that this was always one part of a nationwide campaign aimed at terrorizing all people of color in the United States, intimidating anyone who opposes the fascists, and eroding any constitutional checks on the power of the president. And that campaign is just beginning. Holman made it crystal clear, stating,
"For those that say we are backing down from immigration enforcement or the promise of mass deportations, you are simply wrong.
We know that DHS is still terrorizing LA and Chicago, even as their focus on those cities has waned. And any drawdown in Minnesota means more agents fanning out across the country, whether it's terrorizing students at a bus stop in New Jersey or at a Boys and Girls Club in Olathe, Kansas. Our resistance cannot be contained by specific ICE actions, but must spread throughout the country, demanding the end of the fascist Trump regime at the root of this nationwide crusade. It will take millions of people all across the country pouring into the streets in sustained action to defeat this regime. The high school walkouts against ICE terror, which have continued to spread nationwide, show a glimpse of the strong basis for this potential and should act as inspiration for people of all ages. And the inspiring, heroic resistance of the people of Minnesota, especially the people of the Twin Cities, should be a lesson and a model for us all. In today's interview, we take up the very real and growing danger of a U.S. war on Iran. The fascist Trump regime is once again threatening military action, an illegitimate imperialist act of aggression that would put the lives of thousands, potentially millions at risk if it spreads across the region and beyond. These threats and any attack on Iran are completely outrageous. They have nothing to do with supporting the Iranian people's just struggle against the Islamic Republic and nothing to do with preventing nuclear war. Quite the opposite. They are about tightening U.S. imperialist domination, political, economic, and militarily, over Iran and the entire Middle East. People in this country, the United States, have a responsibility to oppose this aggression, to stand up against the bullying, the threats, and any move toward war. At the same time, we should be clear, the U.S. is the world's top predator, but Iran's theocratic rulers are also brutally reactionary. They have violently repressed their own people, including slaughtering thousands who rose up for justice. The uprisings of the Iranian people, from the recent rebellions against economic misery to the powerful women, life, freedom movement, are overwhelmingly positive, progressive. They deserve our support. This is a moment to oppose fascist Trump's imperialist bullying and stand in solidarity with the Iranian people's struggle for justice and a radically better future. And so before we get to the interview with Marjorie Cohn, I just want to take a minute to set the stakes because the international situation is escalating fast. Stephen Miller, Trump's Goebbels, has now openly declared that the new international law is might makes right. No rules, no sovereignty, no pretense that weaker peoples or entire countries even have the right to exist if they're in the way. Since this interview was recorded, the number of people killed in U.S. strikes in the Caribbean has risen to 133, largely off the coast of Venezuela and Colombia. These are blatant violations of international law, but the Trump fascist regime is going further, asserting the claimed right to wage war anywhere on earth at any time without congressional approval or oversight, mass murder with no due process, Donald Trump's serial murders on the sea, his war crimes against Venezuela, and threats to the whole region are completely lawless and illegitimate. They're part of a strategy to bring Latin America more fully under U.S. domination. This poses extreme danger to the people of Venezuela, to Colombia, to Cuba, to Mexico, to the entire region, and ultimately to the world. But we need to look at the precedents being set right now. The norms of what this regime can get away with are being rewritten in real time. It's legal because we say it is. That's the doctrine. A green light for slaughter, legality be damned. This is how populations are conditioned to accept atrocity. This is how people are trained to see others as disposable, less than human. All of this is unfolding in a world of intense cutthroat competition between nuclear armed powers. Trump's fascist military moves and his drive to bully entire regions carry the real danger of spiraling into nuclear confrontation, one that could threaten the very survival of humanity itself. The Trump regime is acting with urgency, driven by a fascist vision of American dominance. They're moving to lock down the Western Hemisphere, to roll back China's influence and establish a regional base for wider global confrontation. Trump said it plainly while announcing the invasion of Venezuela. American dominance in the Western Hemisphere will never be questioned again. We as people living in this country have a huge responsibility to oppose any and all acts of war against Venezuela, Iran, and wherever Trump threatens, and to do so nonviolently in the streets and in the battle over public opinion. And lastly, have to mention, yesterday, Secretary of State Marco Rubio spoke at the Munich Security Conference. Rubio's Valentine's Day speech was a love letter to white Christian domination. He laid claim to a heritage of genocidal colonial domination the world over to justify a new all-American global crusade, hammering into being global order under the thumb of supposed quote-unquote European identity, reducible to straight-up white power. Have a listen of just a taste of this outrageous speech.
For the United States and Europe, we belong together. America was founded 250 years ago, but the roots began here on this continent long before. The men who settled and built the nation of my birth arrived on our shores carrying the memories and the traditions and the Christian faith of their ancestors as a sacred inheritance, an unbreakable link between the old world and the new. We are part of one civilization, Western civilization. We are bound to one another by the deepest bonds that nations could share, forged by centuries of shared history, Christian faith, culture, heritage, language, ancestry, and the sacrifices our forefathers made together.
His speech received a standing ovation. We will have more analysis to this ominous and outrageous speech, one that cannot be normalized. So stay tuned to our Substack. Be sure to subscribe to it and recommend it to others. With that, here is my conversation with Marjorie Cohn. So today I am so glad to welcome back legal scholar, political analyst Marjorie Cohn. She is a professor emerita at Thomas Jefferson School of Law, the former president of the National Lawyers Guild and criminal defense attorney who writes books and articles and lectures throughout the world about human rights, U.S. foreign policy, and the contradiction between the two. Welcome back, Marjorie. Thanks for joining us.
Thanks for having me, Sam.
So we're talking today about what feels like a rapid collapse of any meaningful limit on U.S. power internationally and what that means for people trying to understand where this is headed. And so I wanted to start with something that I continue to feel hasn't gotten the attention that it has deserved, which is the situation in Venezuela. A couple of days ago, yet another boat was hit by the U.S. military, bringing the death toll from Trump's campaign of attacks on small boats since September, primarily in the waters off the coast of Venezuela, to at least 130 people, as reported by the New York Times. This time, the attack was in the Pacific, and all the boats are said to be involved in drug trafficking, as if that justifies killing all these people. I'm wondering, what do we actually know about these 130 people? Is it legal to kill everyone on a boat if it was smuggling drugs? And is Trump lying again when he claims each of these attacks saves 25,000 lives by destroying drugs before they enter the country?
Well, first of all, Sam, there's no proof that they are smuggling drugs, but let's assume that they are. That is not a capital offense. That does not give the Trump administration any lawful right under domestic or international law to just take them out. This is an extrajudicial killing outside of the judicial system. If there is probable cause to believe that they are committing a crime, then you arrest them and you charge them with a crime and you give them due process. But killing them is absolutely illegal. In fact, the Trump administration argues that this is legal because it's harming the United States, but there's really no evidence at all that Venezuela or the Venezuelan government has been involved in this drug trade. And the other thing is that, getting back to the boats, there are two men from Trinidad and Tobago who have filed a lawsuit through the Center for Constitutional Rights, the ACLU, and some other lawyers in October. They filed a lawsuit on behalf of the mother of one of them and the sister of another of them under the Death on High Seas Act and the Alien Tort Statute. And I should say that they're arguing that the premeditated and intentional killings outside the context of armed conflict, and there is certainly no armed conflict going on in the Caribbean and off the coast of Venezuela, they do not pose an imminent threat of danger, and so they are illegal. Now, the Death on the High Seas Act establishes a legal cause of action for the wrongful deaths that occur on the high seas. The Alien Tort Statute, it's a U.S. statute, and it allows non-citizens to bring lawsuits in U.S. courts for violations of international law, including the prohibition on extrajudicial killing.
I am wondering, do we know anything more about the actual people that have been killed? There's the people that are bringing these suits. Do we know anything else about these individuals that the regime has killed?
Well, they don't all come from Venezuela. Some do come from Colombia. We don't know about most of them. They're just taken out, vaporized, and we are not told who they are. There were 2 people in these strikes, and I think there have been something like 38 strikes, and as you said, roughly 130 people have been killed. 2 people were rescued. There was the first strike in September, which Trump proudly announced and said that it was off the coast of Venezuela, which strengthens the jurisdictional argument that, in fact, this was illegal. But it was what was called a double tap. And you see this sometimes in drone killings where they bomb, and then if everybody isn't killed, then they bomb again. Or they'll bomb, and then if people go to the rescue, they'll bomb the rescuers. That's called a double tap. That is doubly illegal. Cannot target civilians. And of course, these strikes are illegal in the first place.
I was talking to someone the other day, and I was feeling like at a certain point, it feels like the argument itself almost doesn't matter when it comes from this regime, like saying their fentanyl comes from Venezuela or claiming about saving lives by killing people. It seems that the real point is to say an outrageous lie as a fascist power flex. Yet again, he's testing us. What can you do to stop me? Reality is whatever I say it is. And I think that there's a similarity between those lies and their insistence on their right to seize the oil. I don't know if you want to talk more about that seizure, but I do want to get your perspective on kind of what it means when a government is openly treating reality as something it can just override, and what kind of moment does that signal to you?
Well, I agree with you that almost everything that comes out of Trump's mouth, pretty much everything, is a lie. I don't think he's just doing it to show that he can do it, although he certainly loves being an authoritarian. I think there are real reasons that have to do with imperialism that he's doing this. For example, Venezuela, the regime change attempt in Venezuela, the kidnapping of President Maduro and First Lady Celia Flores, totally illegal under international law. The attack was illegal, violated the UN Charter. Forcible regime change is illegal, although they left in place the rest of the Bolivarian government. But he wants the oil. He wants the money. He wants the profit. And this has really been a theme throughout his presidency. He has become infinitely richer throughout, and he's continuing to do that regardless of the law. He said famously, and he doesn't need international law because he has his own morality, which is so absurd. Morality and Donald Trump in the same sentence, they don't even go together. But I think we need to talk a little bit about these oil tankers, because seizing an oil tanker using the ostensible excuse of their sanctioned Venezuelan oil, what are sanctions? Well, the sanctions, and this also goes for many other countries, including Cuba and Iran, sanctions in these contexts are unilateral coercive measures. That's what they're called. They violate the UN Charter because the UN Charter gives only the Security Council the authority to impose sanctions. And so the U.S. imposing sanctions, be it the embargo and blockade of Cuba in 1960, the sanctions against Iran that are crippling the people there and leading to huge protests, and the sanctions against Venezuela that are hurting the Venezuelan people are illegal. Unilateral means that the U.S. is unilaterally imposing them as opposed to the Security Council imposing them, which would be lawful. under the UN Charter. So when they use the excuse, we're seizing these oil tankers because they're carrying sanctioned oil, those are illegal sanctions in the first place, which does not give them the right to seize these oil tankers.
This might be a good time to ask you a little bit more about the situation in Cuba. We've seen within Venezuela proper, since going in and kidnapping the president, it seems that some arrangements were made with the VP to move towards normalizing relations to some extent and allowing commerce to carry on. But my understanding is that the blockade of Cuba hasn't stopped. And I was hoping that you could maybe talk a little bit more about what is the U.S. doing to Cuba right now and what is the impact on the country? You've talked already a little bit about the legality of sanctions, but maybe a little bit more about the impact that they have. And why are they fixated on punishing this small country?
Well, Marco Rubio is Secretary of State, and he has had the Cuban government in his sights his entire professional career. His parents fled Cuba after the Cuban Revolution in 1959, and he has just had it in for Cuba ever since. And so I'm sure that he is largely behind this. Cuba doesn't have any oil, so you can't say, well, they want Cuba for the oil. But interestingly, Sam, in 1960, when they imposed the embargo and then later made it a blockade, punishing other countries for trading with Cuba, the State Department issued a secret memo saying that if we make life so miserable for Cubans, basically starving them to death, then they will rise up and overturn their government. That was the theory then, and that's the theory now. That's what they're trying to do by cutting off the Trump administration, by cutting off Cuba's supply of oil, just strangling that country, which is already in dire economic straits because of the U.S. blockade and the economic and travel embargo and blockade against Cuba. And plus, this is illegal, again, under the UN Charter, which protects the sovereign equality of states, the self-determination of peoples, and that means they have a right to decide their own political and economic system. You know, even though Trump, he's also talking about regime change in Cuba as well. And that's really, I think, where they're headed. When they went in and killed 80-some people, including Cubans who were bodyguards of Maduro and his wife, the first thing I thought of was this is going to happen to Cuba as well. This is where they're headed. Now, Trump issued an executive order and falsely labeled Cuba a national emergency. This goes back to the Monroe Doctrine, where the U.S. is controlling the Western Hemisphere, and it is aimed at forcible regime change. And this illegal blockade has been in effect now for 67 years, and the suffering of the Cuban people is only escalating with this latest blockade. Not according to the Cuban president, Miguel Diaz-Canel, not a single drop of oil has entered Cuba in 2026. And this has taken a heavy toll on transportation, health, education, and other key sectors of the economy. And so the Cuban government has announced certain measures that available fuel is reserved for essential activities, healthcare, water, educational centers. They are building 10,000 solar modules as an alternative form of energy. They have a protection scheme for patients with chronic disease. Other social services, such as banks, will gradually be protected. Workers will be protected. They can work remotely. They can adjust their work schedules. And they have early warning systems, etc. And the Trump administration is threatening other countries through this executive order, saying that any country that trades oil or hydrocarbons with Cuba will see a 10% increase in tariffs on products exported to the U.S. And it's targeting Cuba's main energy suppliers, Venezuela, Mexico, and Russia. And Venezuela was already effectively forced to halt its shipments to oil due to this naval blockade. Russia has declared that it is going to continue supplying fuel to Cuba. China is also going to help Venezuela. Mexico is negotiating over providing oil, but Mexico has just shipped 814 tons of milk, meat, beans, rice, and other foodstuffs to Cuba. This just happened a couple of days ago. So there are some countries that are continuing to help Cuba, notwithstanding these illegal threats in Trump's executive order. But I think that the strategy is to starve Cuba so that the people will rise up against the government. That's not going to happen. There is some opposition, of course, to the government in Cuba, but my understanding is that people by and large oppose foreign interference and support the government.
I think that what's happening with Cuba, with Venezuela, with the regime change, as you put it, or at least regime destabilization, that they're plotting and seeking across the region. It's really important to understand the implications for the people living in the countries that are in the regime's target. And you had spoken earlier to the situation in Iran and sanctions in Iran. And I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about what the Trump regime is aiming to enact with Iran, and under international law, what is actually allowed and what is absolutely not allowed, especially without any provocation.
I think it's pretty clear that Israel and Netanyahu have been pressuring the Trump administration for regime change in Iran. The Netanyahu government has long had Iran in its sights and would love to enact regime change in Iran. They see Iran as an existential threat, even though Iran does not have a nuclear weapon, nor is it developing one, but they're using that as an excuse. Trump has openly called for regime change in Iran. He's surrounded Iran with what he calls a massive armada, threatening them the way he surrounded Venezuela. He has said that he wants to kill the Ayatollah Khamenei in Iran. And he attacked some nuclear sites in Iran in 2025 at the behest of Israel, and Trump claimed that he obliterated Iran's nuclear program, and that actually was not true. And he is trying to, in the words of the administration, collapse Iran's economy. They want to starve Iran of export revenue by sabotaging its oil industry and denying Iran access to hard currency, causing high rates of inflation. Keep in mind that in 2015, there was the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, or the Iran nuclear deal, which was agreed to by P5+1. Those are the 5 permanent members of the UN Security Council, plus Germany and the EU. And they put very strict limits on what Iran was doing with its nuclear program. And in return, Iran received relief from the punishing sanctions, these unilateral coercive measures. And it was working. The IAEA, the International Atomic Energy Agency of the UN, said it was working. But when Trump came in during his first term, he withdrew the U.S. from this JCPOA, even though the JCPOA, the Iran nuclear agreement, had been memorialized in a Security Council resolution. So it is the law. And when the agreement lifted the sanctions on Iran, Iran's inflation rate fell dramatically. Well, after Trump withdrew the U.S. from the Iran nuclear deal, basically it fell apart, the deal without the U.S. The inflation in Iran shot up to almost 40%. That was in 2019. Now, Netanyahu was just at the White House and trying, I think, to get Trump to attack Iran. And Trump, of course, is playing it close to the vest. Trump said nothing definitive came out of the meeting, but there are certain red lines that Israel has here. One of them is no Iran nuclear enrichment. Now, Iran has a right under the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty to enrich uranium for peaceful purposes. That is not a violation of the treaty. That's not illegal. And it's not going to completely stop its uranium enrichment. Also, Israel wants them to end their ballistic missile program. And put yourself in the position of Iran, where Israel, which is a nuclear power, backed up by the U.S., one of the biggest nuclear powers in the world, and give up the ballistic missiles. I wouldn't want to do that either if I were Iran. And also end Iran's support for Hezbollah and, some of these other armed groups. So that's important to keep in mind. On February 7th, Iranian Foreign Minister Abbas Araghchi gave a talk in Doha, Qatar, and he said, and this is interesting, and this is not getting much play at all in the corporate media, understandably, because they don't cover things like this. He said, Palestine is the defining issue of justice in West Asia and beyond. He condemned Israel's program in Palestine, and especially the annexation of the West Bank, and he offered the U.S. a political solution. He said, justice for Palestine, accountability for crimes, and I think he's meaning for the genocide that Israel continues to perpetrate against the Palestinian people for more than 2 years now. An end to the occupation and apartheid, and the International Court of Justice, by the way, has said that both Israel's occupation of Palestinian territory and the apartheid system violate international law. And he also said, and again, this is the Iranian foreign minister, that a regional order must be based on sovereignty, equality, and cooperation. The world wants peace, not aggression. And he talked about the creation of a Palestinian state. None of that is particularly controversial, I don't think, at least in my mind. And he talked about a renewed nuclear agreement, which Iran would ostensibly agree to, strictly limiting Iran to peaceful nuclear activities, which is what they say they're doing, and the lifting of U.S. and EU sanctions. It seems perfectly reasonable to me. Also, one other thing I should say is if you go back to 1953, when the democratically elected Prime Minister of Iran, Mohammad Mossadegh, nationalized the British oil industry, that's when the CIA engineered a coup, overthrew Mossadegh, and reinstalled the vicious Shah, who then for the next 25 years, talk about a terrorist, he committed a reign of terror, torture, and just atrocities against his people until 1979, until the Iranian Revolution. And so the U.S. certainly has a history of regime change. They had denied it for many years. Trump proudly announced that they had gone in and, he didn't use the word kidnapped, seized President Maduro, but it reminded me, at least on some level, of what the U.S. had done in Iran. So it's all connected. U.S. imperialism, U.S., the law of the jungle, violating international law with impunity, lack of accountability, and these so-called sanctions, unilateral coercive measures, highly illegal, but aimed to strangle countries and make them knuckle under, change their regimes, which is illegal, and knuckle under to the will of the U.S. government, in this case, Donald Trump.
Thank you so much for your time and for joining us. And we will put in the show notes a link to your website.
Okay, I appreciate that. Thank you very much. Take care. Bye-bye.
Thanks for listening to Refuse Fascism. Support this show by becoming a patron. Join today at patreon.com/refusefascism or subscribing to our Substack. See the link in the show notes. Or get some of our merch, hoodies, t-shirts, and more available in the store. Or for $0, you can help build our audience by sharing this show, rating and reviewing on Apple Podcasts or your listening platform of choice, subscribing for free to our Substack, or recommending our Substack to others. And be sure to stay connected for developments and actions by visiting refusefascism.org and following us on social media at Refuse Fascism. You can also text REFUSE to 855-755-1314, so you're always in the loop. Thanks to Richie Marini, Lena Thorne, and Mark Tinkleman for helping produce this episode. We'll be back next Sunday. Until then, in the name of humanity, we refuse to accept a fascist America.